All right. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for coming to our webinar tonight. I'm hoping everybody can hear me. Aileen, do you think you could give me a signal if you can hear me?
I can hear you.
Sounds good. Okay, so my name is Nikki. I'm from the Oak Ridges Moraine Land Trust. I mostly work in our outreach programs. I know we're probably going to get a few more participants logging on as we go, but I'll just get started with our introduction so you can learn a little bit more about us before we hand it over to Basil. So we like to start off actually with a land acknowledgement. Sorry, we'll go back for a moment. So when we do these land acknowledgements, we just like to remind everyone to be mindful. And something that I always think about when I hear these words is the generations and generations that have gone into this, and also the generations in the future. There's so much stewardship that's gone on before you and I have gotten here, and there's so much stewardship to do in the future together. So with that, I'll get us started. We would like to start by acknowledging that we are on the traditional territories of the Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, and the Anishinaabe peoples. Their presence here continues to this day and beyond. We would also like to acknowledge that the land we are on is at the meeting place of two treaties, the lands of the Mississaugas of the Credit and those of the First Nations of the Williams Treaties. We always thank them and other Indigenous peoples for sharing their land with us. We would also like to acknowledge the Chippewas of Georgina Island First Nation as our closest Indigenous community. We acknowledge this land and the people because the first step to reconciliation is recognizing the existence of Indigenous people and their effect on the land. A shared understanding of how our collective past brought us to where we are today is going to help us walk together into a better future for us all. We give deep gratitude to the Indigenous peoples of these lands who have been stewards of the land since time immemorial. The Oak Ridges Moraine Land Trust endeavors to honor the land and treaties by strengthening our relationship with you and strengthening our responsibilities to them. So thank you for everyone for joining me, and that typically is something that we say that relates to our base in Newmarket, in the York region, and Durham regions, but now that we're online, it does spread beyond that. So a little bit of the Oak Ridges Moraine. It is located within the Greenbelt, which is something not everybody knows. It is an environmentally sensitive geological landform that is really unique. It stretches 160 kilometers from the Trent River in the east to the Niagara Escarpment, and it's home to a lot of important habitats because it is such a unique feature. So this is a little map of the Oak Ridges Moraine. It's a simple map. It does show the Greenbelt plan. So as you can see, the dark green is the Greenbelt, and then the light green is where the moraine is. It's very wide in some areas from north to south, but in some areas it's very, very thin. So it's important to protect all the way across. And I'll mention also that those little dots are most of our properties as of 2018, although we are growing. They are in and around the moraine, and although they're not 100% exactly where those are, the reasoning is because we do have a lot of private properties. We do have landowners living on those properties, and so we don't give out the exact location. This gives you a really good idea of where they are. So why do we protect the Oak Ridges Moraine, and why should you? Well, it was developed about 13,000 years ago during the Ice Age. And as you know, that's not something that happens overnight, and it's hopefully not something that's going to happen soon. So, you know, we have to protect it while it's here, and once it's gone, it's gone. It has an amazing but delicate aquifer system, so groundwater system, which is responsible for recharging the fresh water for over 250,000 people. That's something that's unique to Canada. Canada has an abundance of fresh water, but it can be easily polluted, so that's something to think about. 90% of the moraine is under private ownership, which has a lot of potential for people who care about protecting their land, but it also means that we really need to get the idea out there that it's worth protecting, because it is. And it also has potential for unique habitat, but again, that's something that we need to decide on as communities. We have to decide to maintain that habitat for the abundant amount of species at risk. In terms of what the Land Trust does, it's something that not a lot of people, again, know about. we are currently supporting a lot of the same goals as the federal government. They have the ambitious goal of protecting 25% of Canadian land by 2025. They also want to hit on climate change resiliency, connecting people with land and creating wildlife corridors. So right now we're protecting about 4,400 acres of land, and that's under a lot of different sort of requirements. So that's 12 nature reserves, 43 registered conservation easements, 3 restricted covenants, and 2 properties in joint ownership. We also support climate change resilience by protecting a lot of our services, our ecosystem services. And a big one is flood control. As you know, floods can create a lot of damage. And if we don't take care of our wetlands and other water habitats and floodplains, then we're going to see a lot more of that damage in our infrastructure. We also support species at risk in vulnerable regions, as we mentioned. We protect your drinking water, and we also help connect you to that land. And although I'm mentioning a lot of we in these statements, when you become part of that community, you become part of that we. So these are some pictures that our program manager, Aileen, took. These are some of the species that we have on our land, and they are pretty vulnerable. So we have the screech owl, we have bobolinks, we have the Blanding's turtle. You can see the yellow neck there. Also swallow, the colorful swallow. And now a little bit more technical. We're just going to chat quickly about acquiring land and how you can contribute if you want to. We usually acquire land not by purchasing. We are a charity. We don't have a huge bank, so we take a lot of programs and donations and conversations with landowners in order to protect land. One way we do it is through the Ecological Gifts Program, and it allows land to be federally protected forever. And I will mention anytime we acquire land, it is protected forever. There are significant tax benefits that come with this program. There's also legacy giving, which is something to think about if you're ever worried that, you know, when you're gone one day, what's going to happen to your land? You don't want to see condos built on it one day, but that might not be your choice. So when you sort of partner with us, whether it's through a donation or some other way of having us protect your land, that ensures that it's never going to see development. That can also take place through the Ecological Gifts Program as well. And there's other ways to talk to us. So if you have land and maybe you're not ready to do anything with it yet, you can start the conversation years in advance. Just reach out to us and talk about the options. In terms of getting involved in different ways, we do have a volunteer list. We're not using it right now as much as we'd like to, just because of COVID, but there's no reason you can't get on the list. We also have the opportunity to become a member, which allows you to get a little bit more involved in what we do and the decisions that we make, and meet the board of directors and hear from them. And of course, you can donate. We are a charity, like I mentioned, and you know, the more gifts that we receive, the more we can do as an organization with the community. So all of those options are on our website. You can sign up to volunteer, become a member, or donate through our website, or you can chat with us. I know I've sent you lots of emails. You can always reply to that. And lastly, before I hand it over to Basil, we do free outreach programs to really connect you, educate you with nature, or on nature, and just really teach you about your land and how to protect it properly. So our upcoming event is pretty cool. It's called the BioBlitz All-Star Challenges. You can participate right from home. We're going to have BioBlitz All-Stars. They're signed up to compete with each other on our private properties to find the most species possible. You can join one of their teams and submit all of your findings from your backyard or natural area and help them win. So we have a Battle of the Birders coming up, Habitat Heroes, so it's different habitats, and a Mothathon. So after this webinar, I think you'll definitely ace that one. So with that, I'm gonna hand it over to Basil. He's a lifelong naturalist and an absolute moth lover, and I think he's pretty lucky that he figured out moths are awesome pretty early in life. So with that, I am going to stop sharing my screen and hand it over to him. All right, Baz, you there?
Hello, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Hey, how's it going? Hold on one second here.
Okay, yeah, it's a little choppy, but hopefully it'll be all right.
Hopefully. All right. So Ooh, before I started, I wanted to do a quick game of moth trivia for everybody who's here. Just shout it out at home what you think the answer is. How many species of moth eat your clothes? Is it A2, B10, C20, D100, or E all of them? The answer is actually 2. So in Ontario, we have 2 species of moth that are responsible for eating people's clothes, mainly their wool fabrics. That's the webbing clothes moth and the case-making clothes moth, which are 2 really interesting moths. They evolved to feed on fur and rodent burrows, and now they've found out that humans have wool sweaters, and they've moved into people's houses and are kind of making a killing that way. But compared to those 2 species of moth that eat your clothes, how many species of moth occur in Ontario? Is it A, 100, B, 435, C, 1200, D, 2150, or E, 3187? It's the one that I made most complicated, the most complicated number. That's the latest guide for moths. The latest list of moths for Ontario by Dave Beadle they list 3,187 species, but it could be as high as 3,200 species. There's still moths being found that are new records for the province every year. On iNaturalist, they list 2,634 confirmed species of moths for Ontario. So there's still a lot of moths that we have historical records of. So you might be able to find a lot of sort of new recent records. All right. So here we are in the middle of a sugar maple forest in Algonquin Park. And this is in Algonquin Park, but there's lots of areas that are very similar to this in the Oak Ridges Moraine. You can walk along these trails and sometimes not, other than hearing birds, not find a lot of wildlife. But as the sun goes down and with the right equipment, a hidden diversity of life emerges.
Outside the window, beautiful and strange.
That was a video my friend Pete made me. It was back when we were in Algonquin.
Hey, Baz,
naturalists.
it is a little
Yes?
choppy. Do you want to try turning off your video?
Yeah, of course. Let's try. Looking for where it is. Stop my video. All right, there we go. So night hath 1,000 eyes. Yeah. So is it good now? Can you guys hear me?
Yep.
Is it good? Is it good?
Yep. We hear cars
Right.
or something in the background.
Yes.
Yeah, you'll hear those. Here, hold on a second. Let me try to Okay. Sorry about that. There we go. Night hath 1,000 eyes. So some moths take that phrase literally. Luna moths with their big, beautiful eye structures on their wings. To know moths is to know the universe. So a friend of mine, Carl Barentine, he is a moth man who lives down in North Dakota. And he said this phrase years ago, and it kind of stuck with me. To know moths is to know the universe. But what exactly does that mean? For me, moths have been a way of loving nature and experiencing nature in a completely new way. And once you start learning about moths, you start to see connections to everything else. But what exactly are moths? Memes have been very popular lately on social media. And if you were to look at a moth meme and think that this is a moth, basically what you have is a creepy brown insect with an addiction to lights. But moths are so much more than that. Moths, like all insects, have the same body structure. They have a head with antennae. They have a thorax with legs and wings. And then they have the abdomen where the internal organs and the sex organs are located. Moths like this lettered habersign, you can see on this lettered habersign that they have 4 wings. And on the left, I've just listed a few. Don't worry about memorizing this. If you want to take a screenshot of it, these are some of the important points to mark on a moth's wing for identification. So let's lettered Haberdine, for example, has a very prominent basal dash, and its post-medial line, PM line, is very distinct. Moths also all have a proboscis, which is otherwise known as a forward feeder. It's these tube-like mouth parts that extend forwards and curl underneath the mouth when at rest. This hologram moth is feeding on salts on my finger. Other moths, like these banded tussock moths, feed on nectar. This video that I took of them last a few Julys ago, these moths were crawling around on the milkweed, getting their legs stuck in the flowers, and then transporting pollen from flower to flower. So during the day, bees are pollinating milkweed, and at night you have parties of moths, like these banded tussock moths. But moths don't just use their proboscis for feeding on salt and flower nectar. They also feed on rotting fruit. So this Canadian owlet has piercing mouth parts that can feed on rotting fruit, often choke cherries. Moths in the same genus Calyptra in Asia are known as vampire moths. Because if we look at there, we have that sharp proboscis. The vampire moths in Asia will feed on blood and things like that. So our Canadian owlet is in the same genus, is closely related to these vampire moths, but they live mostly in northern Ontario, where the largest animal around is typically moose. So maybe next time if you're paddling up north, you might take a closer look and you might discover something new. Some Canadian owlets feeding on a moose. Other moths don't have feeding mouth part, don't have proboscis, they have chewing mouths. So this gold-cap moss eater is a member of an ancient family, the mandibulate moths, and they have chewing mandibles for feeding on pollen. So they evolved before the proboscis. Moths are also members of the insect order Lepidoptera, which means scaly wing. So moths have these fantastic wings that are coated in these overlapping shingles of scales. The scales are deciduous, which means that they come off when you touch them. And this helps moths when they get caught into a spider web, those scales will rub off and they can fly away. Or if they're caught, even if you catch one in your hand, those scales will rub off and it will fly away from you. But these scales also form pixels, almost like on a TV screen, where each scale is a different color. And as you zoom out, you start to see this beautiful pattern emerge that is extremely unique in the animal kingdom. Moths can make all sorts of different patterns, eye spots. They can look just like bark on the outside of a tree. Really fantastic, and they owe it all to those deciduous scales. But there's always exceptions. Hummingbird clearwings have patches of wings that are scale-less, so they can mimic a bumblebee and not get eaten by birds. But if you look here, this Dervilla clearwing, this is an image from Bug Guide. This female has just emerged from her pupa in the soil, and she's climbed up onto a piece of grass and expanded her wings. But she hasn't flown yet, so she has a thin coating of scales. She's used pheromones to attract a male who has been flying around, and so he has scale-less wings. And he is mating with her before she's even flown for the first time, which is pretty fantastic. At this point, you might be wondering what the difference is between moths and butterflies. Butterflies are just moths with better PR people. But butterflies are a type of moth. They're a super family of moths, the Papilionoidea. But they do have some differences that distinguish them from the other moths. Butterflies often hold their wings above their body at rest, and they have clubbed antennae. So if you see a lepidopteran feeding on a flower and it has those clubbed antennae, it's a butterfly. In contrast, moths like this Polyphemus moth have either thread-like or fuzzy antennae, and then they hold their wings flat over their body. This many plume moth is a sort of a weird looking insect. We know it's a moth because it has scaly wings. So that's something to remember. All moths have those scaly wings. Moth species outnumber butterflies about 10 to 1. So when we're learning about butterflies, that really is the tip of the iceberg, and moths kind of complete the picture. Now, at this point, you might be wondering how to attract moths. So I have a lot of different, the best way to attract moths is using lights. But which lights do you use? I've had a lot of success with the top left corner, the reptile UVB bulb has been successful for me. I've been using that for years, and it's a wonderful light. Also, black lights, 2 black lights are really, really good. You can buy them on Amazon really cheap. The bottom is a mercury vapor bulb with a self ballast. I've used those a few times and they work really well. But honestly, if you just want to switch out your porch light to a reptile UVB bulb, you'll attract moths and get to view them. It's really easy. This is one of my old setups. So this was, I just put a sheet up against the house and plugged in those black lights and that reptile UVB bulb, and I've got a ton of moths. One night we even had 6 Luna moths at once. This is up, so you don't often get these dramatic results south, but you get the same species in the Oak Ridges Moraine that you would see here. But these are just using simple reptile UVB bulb and a black light from Canadian Tire. Last year, I made my rig portable, so I bought a 12-volt lawnmower battery and then used a power inverter and attached a black light and the reptile UVB bulb to that. And this runs for about 9 hours on one charge before it goes out. I'm going to show my video for a second because I wanted to show this other light that I got. So now I have a LEPI LED, and this is what it looks like when it's plugged in. When I turn it off, it looks like this. But you can buy these on gunnerbrem.de. Look up LEPI LED. It's a light that is specifically made to attract moths. So it's incredibly bright there. It shoots out bright ultraviolet radiation and at the exact frequency that has been found to attract moths, and it works really, really well. So if you're willing to spend money and you're serious about moths, LEPI LED works really well. I power it on this phone charger, and this is a really easy thing to carry around. The lawnmower battery rig was very heavy. It was about 25 pounds. So the LEPI LED is a lot lighter. If you don't want to buy the LEPI LED, this light here, it's a UVB bulb that runs on a USB stick. And plug it in here. It's exceptionally bright. So it's very, very bright and very ultraviolet, and moths are very attracted to ultraviolet light. So this works well for attracting moths, and it runs on that phone charger. And this rig here, the phone charger and the light is probably about $60. So it's a good cheap buy if you want to get into mothing. So all that can be found on Amazon. So this is what it looks like when it's out in the wild. The best place you want to set your moth rig up is where different habitats kind of connect. So for example, in this one, this was an oak and beech forest in the Rice Lake Plains. And I set up right on the edge of the forest next to some willow shrubs and alders. And then there's a little bit of a wetland. So you sort of have 3 habitats sort of combining. And with this, you get the best results when you're mothing. A tip from Carl, you can customize your porch light. So this is just a hamper with with those lights that I showed you, the reptile UVB bulb, black light, and the moths then will fly and kind of collect on the outside of the laundry hamper. And you can photograph them in the morning and then shake the laundry hamper out in a safe area in some bushes and let the moths go. Also, a great way to moth is to build a trap. So I've never built a moth trap. I just set up the sheet and see what comes. But Mike Burrell wrote, he's a really good naturalist. He wrote a wonderful blog on how to design an inexpensive moth trap. And the idea about a moth trap is you basically have a bucket with your light on top and a hole in the bottom with a funnel into the bottom where they find egg cartons and they'll rest in the egg cartons, and then you can take them out individually and photograph them in the morning. And this is a wonderful way to moth. I've never really done it, but it works with a lot of people's lifestyles. You can take a moth trap and set it in the middle of the woods and come back the next morning and see what's shown up. So it's really cool. Another way to attract moths is with moth bait. Moth bait is essentially just sticky, syrupy, alcoholic, fermenting fluid that you paint on the outside of trees to attract moths. The best times to do this is generally in the spring and in the fall, when a lot of moths are looking for sap flows, or they're looking for rotten fruit later in the year. They'll be very attracted to your moth bait. And the general recipe is just 1 or 2 overripe bananas, a stale beer. I like to put a shot of rum or a cup of brown sugar, some molasses, just fluid, mix it all together. I usually, when I can't do bananas, I'll use a can of peaches and syrup, and that works wonderfully. Some people like to let their moth bait sit for a couple of days, but I don't find it's that necessary. But it will attract moths that might not be attracted to lights, that are more attracted to a food reward.
Hey,
and
Baz.
Yep.
Sorry, I'm sorry to interrupt you again. We're just seeing like these gray boxes on your screen that are obscuring some of like the names of your moths and some of your text. Are you seeing anything like that? Whether it's like a text box from Zoom or something?
I see. It's like
Yeah.
like subtitles.
Okay. Oh, that's what those are. We turned on closed captioning for the first time, but it's not showing up as words, so maybe that's the problem.
Oh,
okay.
Yeah.
I'll see if I can disable those then.
Okay, no worries.
Okay, thanks.
Want me to give you a second?
No, that's okay. You keep chatting. I'll try to fix that.
All right.
Okay.
But yeah, so like I was saying, mothing can be a great experience. This is a moth party I went to a few years ago with a lot of really, really, really good knowledgeable moth people. And it's just a great learning experience. We can't really do this now, but in a couple years we can kind of be all together. But in the meantime, what I really like about the moth challenge that you were talking about earlier is it's people can connect remotely by kind of doing their own moth setups. And mothing is compared to other things, it's a very easy hobby. You're just turning on a light and attracting moths. So it's a great way of getting a large amount of nature without necessarily a large amount of work. Now I'm going to talk briefly about a few species. As I said, we have over 3,000 species in Ontario. So I'm not going to talk about all of those. I'm going to mention a few of them in a few different contexts. Before I continue, I wanted to point out the difference between micromoths and macromoths. So these are kind of this distinction where small moths, their families are grouped under the micromoths, and larger moths are grouped under macromoths. So the moths that I'll be showing, I'll list the family that they're under. But generally understanding that there's a difference between moths, that there's micromoths and macromoths will help you in your identification. So if you see a moth, you want to ask yourself, does this look like a micromoth? Is it on the small side, or is this a macromoth? Is it on the large side? And what exactly is a large and a small moth? Well, that's something you'll sort of find out as you go along, basically. The ones that I've underlined here are the ones that have the largest amount of members in their family. So micromoths, the leaf rollers, there's like 400 species of them that occur in Ontario of just leaf rolling moths. So if you understand what a twirler, a leaf blotch miner, a leaf roller is, and if you understand what inchworms look like, what underwings look like, what owlets look like, you'll sort of understand, you'll understand what moths look like, and you'll be able to get them to family, which then leads you to get them to species quicker. These, as I said before, moth numbers are constantly changing, and this image by Josh Vandermeulen was the first sighting of an adult of an entirely new family of moth for Ontario, the plant hopper parasite moths. As the name suggests, the caterpillar, which is this white bulb that looks like a fungus, the caterpillars feed on plant hoppers as a parasite, feeding on their bodily fluids before they turn into a moth. So we have a whole new family of parasitic moths that live in Ontario, which is, I think, absolutely amazing. So Jeff Pecker took this image, and it's just fantastic. So I wanted to talk a little bit about moths in the context of the seasons. So what moths you can see at what time of year. Winter, which just passed, you might think you can't find a lot of moths in winter, but a lot of moths overwinter as adults in leaf litter underneath the snow or behind loose bark. Some of them overwinter as caterpillars. So woolly bear overwinter as caterpillars. And this one I found in the middle of ice on a warm February day. So it had crawled out onto the ice and then gotten cold and became less active. So I picked it up in my hand and it warmed up and started moving around, and I put it under some loose wood so it could come out in the summer and complete its life. Moths can also be found in the pupal stage. Most moths, I would think most moths overwinter as a pupa generally. Either as a pupa in soil or in leaf litter, or in the case of the Cecropia moth, as a big conspicuous bag on the edge of a plant during the winter. These then complete their life cycle the following year and emerge as adults in the summer. In springtime, so spring is where we are right now, thankfully, finally after a very long winter. And these are some moths that are sort of, you can find around here. So generally the first moths that I find are the moths that have overwintered as adults. So this dimorphic pinion overwintered as an adult, and it came to some sticky bait that I put out very early in the season, in March actually. So moths start showing up March, and then it's sort of a slow climb, and they sort of start to reach a peak in May. Comstock sallow are another one of the earliest moths that come out. They overwinter as pupae in soil, and are one of the first ones to emerge like this early in the spring. So they're still flying, but starting to finish right about now. They're still flying in Halliburton. I saw one the other night. Halliburton is where I live, which is way far out of the Oak Ridges Moraine, but you get these species in the Oak Ridges Moraine as well. Once trees start to bloom, moths can be found nectaring. These owlet moths were all nectaring on common lilac, which is not native. This was growing in my backyard, and I found at least 3 species of owlet moths that were nectaring on it at night. So sometimes cherry trees, apple trees as well get covered in moths at night. So if you have an apple tree blooming, a cherry tree blooming, lilacs, check them at night, generally right after the sun goes down, and you'll probably find moths nectaring and doing their thing on your flowers, which is really cool. One of my favorite moths that come out in May is the chinkapin leaf miner, which is a member of the sparkling archaic sun moths. These moths, they, as larvae, feed on the developing leaves of an oak tree. So this is an oak that was just developing. The distinct opening is an area is where the moth laid its egg. The caterpillar then fed in between the leaf layers before plopping out as a mature larva and then overwintering as a pupa in the soil. So these are leaf mining moths. We have a whole bunch. We have several hundred, at least 200 of leaf mining moth in Ontario. I can't cover them very well here. The chinkapin leaf miner is just one of them. But leaf miners of Ontario on iNaturalist.ca, you can see a whole bunch of species that are being reported. And a lot of times you can just take a picture of their distinctive leaf mine and identify a species just based on the leaf mine. So leaf mining moths are really, really cool. And they are a type of micromoth. This time of year, eastern tent caterpillars are emerging. I've been seeing a lot of these on my walks. A lot of people don't like eastern tent caterpillars, but I really love them. They provide food for birds like black-billed cuckoos and goldfinches. And when they spread out on these cherry trees, they'll often defoliate them, but then the cherry trees are able to bounce back, and they often have a bit of a protein boost from caterpillar frass. Another tent caterpillar we have is the forest tent caterpillar, and the way you identify it is it has a wing back. If we look at the eastern tent caterpillar, it's a stripe. The forest tent caterpillar, they have these little penguins. And forest tent caterpillars tend to occur by themselves. They're not in that web and mass on a tree like the eastern tent caterpillars. They tend to be more and less social and just kind of go off on their own. These are not to be confused with gypsy moths, which are invasive species. Gypsy moth caterpillars can be identified by their row of 4 blue dots and then 6 red dots, and they're extremely hairy. After last year, I'm sure we all know what gypsy moths look like. Last year was I believe it was a 30-year high for gypsy moths, and their population just exploded, which is which is not really a good thing. If you think you look at all these trees that are getting completely defoliated, if they're 100% defoliated, and that means there's less food for other species that feed on oak trees. So gypsy moths can be really damaging, but their frass will hopefully fertilize those trees. And I remember last year I was seeing oak trees bouncing back, 1 or 2 weeks after being defoliated, and it was a drought year, so trees can bounce back, but the effects of this are to be debated. These are what adult gypsy moths look like, the males. They're just these brown moths that fly in abundance in July. In spring, the sphinx moths start to emerge. So the first sphinx moths are just emerging now. The Davila clearwing tends to fly a little bit later in spring, in early June. We also get the laurel sphinx. Sphinxes can be identified because they tend to have that bullet-shaped body with those really kind of strong angular wings. And they tend to be fairly large. So laurel sphinxes are one of our larger moths. Canadian sphinx here. This species feeds on black ash. We also have blinded sphinxes. So some sphinxes have those eye spots to scare predators away on their hind wings. And then here we find our cecropia moth pupa. So giant silk moths like the cecropia moth are starting to emerge right now. This is an interesting fact. So luna moths and polyphemus moths have been showing up right now at lights, which is about 2 weeks earlier than normal. So cecropia moths like this one here that overwintered as a pupa for me. This is a caterpillar that I raised, and it emerges as adult. But these ones might be showing up at lights basically any time now, which is a little bit ahead of schedule. Cecropia moths, like all moths, go through complete metamorphosis. So they start off as an egg that hatches as a small caterpillar that grows and changes color and shape as it matures, shedding its skin 5 times. It then forms a cocoon, overwinters, and then emerges as an adult moth. So all moths go through this complete metamorphosis from egg to caterpillar to pupa to adult moth. Are sort of the trio that emerged at this time of year: the luna moth, the polyphemus, and the cecropia moth. These ones, as I said, could be emerging could be showing up at lights at any time now, which is really exciting. I always mark it on my calendar the day that I get all 3 species at a light. They're just absolutely fantastic. But our luna moths our giant silk moths are a little bit unique. If we look at this luna moth, you'll notice it doesn't have a mouth. So we said that we noticed that. Sorry, we talked about probosces and how moths have that coiled proboscis for feeding on food. The luna moth doesn't have that. Their mouths are completely flat. So you might be wondering, how do I eat? Luna moths and other giant silk moths don't eat. They do all their feeding as a caterpillar and then overwinter as a pupa and then emerge just to mate and then die after usually about 1 or 2 weeks. So summer. The emergence of the giant silk moths tends to sort of mark the beginning of summer for me, but a lot of moths sort of start to show up around the beginning of July, such as these forest tent caterpillars. This is what the adults look like. They're sort of as close as you can get to a teddy bear in moth form, and they tend to show up at lights starting in July. Also gold-spotted ghost moths. So the family Hepialidae, the ghost moths, really sort of are summer to me. These guys start to emerge in July, and if you're lucky enough to see them, they have a really interesting mating ritual. The males send out pheromones that then attract the females, and the males then sort of compete amongst each other for access to the females. They then mate, and the males drop down dead in a display at sunset that lasts for about 15 minutes. So it's a really, really interesting and sort of complicated chemical dance that they do, which is also known as a lek. Other species that lek include grouse and birds, but moths like these ghost moths also lek. I tried to raise caterpillars of the four-spotted ghost moth because moths are generally, there's not really a lot known about them. So anything that you can find out about them is useful. I collected this female a couple years ago on a warm July night, and she was full of eggs. So they can lay 6,000 plus eggs. After the female mates with the male that she's chosen, she'll fly around and disperse thousands of eggs, hoping that they find their host plant and survive. Once some of these guys emerged, I decided to try to feed them on mushrooms, because I thought that they probably feed on mushrooms or on mosses and stuff like that before they eventually burrow into the roots of aspen trees. So here they are in this video. I fed them on oyster mushrooms, and they made these little silken tunnels and ate that and grew really well. So you can see them in their little silken tunnels here, feeding on oyster mushrooms. So that was new information and pretty interesting find. The caterpillars aren't much to look at. They're just kind of clear and live in soil, but yeah, pretty cool. Tiger moths are another group of moths that come out in July, and they're quite flashy. You can find them starting now. There's species that come out early in the season in May and June, but generally in July is when you start to see flashy ones like the great tiger moth, species like the painted lichen moth, which mimics fireflies, and the Virginia tiger moth with its the virgin tiger moth with its almost stained glass like wings. At the tip of this virgin tiger moth's head is a ball of fluid, and this ball of fluid is basically is a free sample for me. Basically, it's a taste of this moth's poisonous hemolymph, which is another word for its blood. So it has glands on the top of its head that's secreting this nasty tasting fluid, so that me, a mammal, a bird, or an amphibian that wants to try to eat this moth will know that it's disgusting and bitter tasting and avoid it. But how do moths like these, when they're flying around at night, they're brightly colored and they have that free sample to keep daytime predators away, but how do they keep nighttime predators away? The virgin tiger moth has very large ears on the side of its body, so they can hear bats when they're calling at night. And when they hear a bat, they crack an organ underneath their wing called a tymbal, kind of like the top of a pop can, kind of making a crackling sound. You make this popping sound at a very high frequency to scare bats away. So I'll play it here for you. I'm just going to play it one more time. So what you just saw there is a video from a friend of mine, Nick Dowdy, who has been studying tiger moths. And what he's done is you're seeing that little organ underneath the moth's ear, and it's cracking an ultrasonic frequency in response to the sound of bats. So this sound, the idea is that this sound that the moths make confuses bats and will sort of throw their sonar away and allow moths to escape being eaten. So moths like this Isabella tiger moth can avoid getting eaten during the day and at night. During July, caterpillars tend to become very common, and caterpillars like Luna moths can be seen in late July and into early August. Walnut sphinxes rely on camouflage to avoid being eaten, but they also have a secret, another secret. Dr. Jane Yak at Carleton University discovered that they scream. I'll play it one more time. So what you just saw there is the walnut sphinx. It's shooting air out of holes on the sides of its body and making a loud squeaking sound in response to getting pinched. This squeal will keep one of the caterpillar's worst predators from eating it, wasps. Wasps will try to lay their eggs on these caterpillars or bring the caterpillars back to feed to their nests. And that squeal is generally enough to scare that wasp away and save the caterpillar from being eaten. And once it survives, it turns into this beautiful walnut sphinx. As summer progresses, fruit trees start to mature, and as I said before, a lot of moths feed on rotting fruit. These owlets were found on a fire cherry bush at the end of July, feeding on moldy fruit. There was a whole, like an entire 12-foot tall tree was just covered in these owlet moths feeding on rotting fruit. So if you know a place where there's cherry bushes, definitely check them at this time of year and you'll find moths. As fall progresses, mothing continues. It slows down a little bit, but there's still lots of cool species to see. Species like this large Tallamy start to look a little bit like us as fall goes on. They start to become puffier and wear these thick sweaters to insulate them from the cold fall nights. One of my favorite group of moths, the owlet moths, or sorry, the underwing moths, the genus Catocala, start to show up in fall. Species like the white underwing often come to lights, but other species like the Ilia underwing are more commonly found at bait. So if you make that moth bait mixture we talked about before, where it was, rotting fruit, alcohol, and sugar, and you just paint that on trees in the fall, you're likely to find these large underwing moths. They're called underwings because their hind wings have that flash of color that they pop out to try to scare predators away. You can often get lots of them. So last fall we had habilis and residuo underwings. Sometimes 3 or 4 species. So bait can be a lot more productive than lights in the fall. Another great way to see moths in the fall is to check goldenrod. Goldenrods are often covered with moths just after sunset throughout the fall. Boring moths, like this bracken borer, they are one of the sort of the hallmark moths of the fall, the bracken borer and the pink-barred sallow. They blend in very well with fall leaves. The brown satyr moth is one of the last moths that show up for me. I've seen brown satyr moths they generally start about the end of October into November. And then one of the last moths that emerge in the fall is the Bruce spanworm, which is an inchworm moth. And these guys emerge in November and then flying into December. Sometimes they're known as winter moths because they're often found on winter days. And they overwinter as eggs. So the female is wingless, and she lays her eggs and cracks on bark on maple trees, which is their host plant. And then when they hatch as caterpillars in the fall, they feed on maple leaves and then pupate during the summer and then emerge at the end of the season as adults to complete their life cycle. All right, I'm going to talk just very, very briefly about threats to moths. Climate change, of course, is the #1 threat to just about everything right now. But moths face a number of threats. #1 is habitat loss, which is why conservation agencies like the Oak Ridges Moraine Land Trust are so important, because habitat loss is very, very important. We talked about how a lot of moths will have their own host plant. So there might be one species of plant, kind of like with monarchs and milkweed. There's if you don't have that one species of plant, the insect that feeds on it can't survive. So habitat for moths can look like a lot of things. It can look like areas being bulldozed, or it can look like a specific species of plant disappearing. And that sort of leads us to introduced pests. So species like Phragmites, is a plant that reduces plant diversity. So having introduced invasive plants in an environment, degrading environments, that threatens moths by eliminating their host plant. Light pollution is also a factor. It's probably not the most important factor in declines, but it definitely, is something to consider. There was a paper that came out recently that showed that they looked at a whole bunch of different lights that are commonly used as porch lights, and incandescent bulbs attracted the most, and warm LED lights attracted the least. So for your porch light, you might want to consider, if you're not photographing moths and trying to attract moths with the lights that I told you about, you might want to consider changing to a warm LED light to attract the least moths. And then finally, white-tailed deer are something that white-tailed deer abundance is something that affects moth numbers. So you might be thinking, white-tailed deer, how could they possibly affect moths? Well, This is a forest in Peterborough, and it has an overabundance of deer because there's a lot of cornfields and soy fields and all these areas that produce abundant numbers of white-tailed deer. And then the white-tailed deer go into the forest and they create this browse line that just eliminates plant diversity. They're eating all the plants that caterpillars need, and they're often eating the immature stages by accident. And so having overpopulations of white-tailed deer because humans have altered the environment can affect moths negatively. Without deer, this is a forest, sugar maple forest, and this is an area where there's almost no deer, and you can see there's no browse line. So with deer, without deer is pretty drastic. So once you start to observe moths, the best thing for you to do is to join inaturalist.ca. So iNaturalist is a wonderful website. Hopefully a lot of you are already on it, but basically you record your observations, you upload them to the website, and then experts go on there and identify it for you or confirm your identification, and then your record becomes part of sort of scientific knowledge and becomes part of a larger database. There's a group on there, the Moths of Ontario iNaturalist project, and when I took this screenshot, they had 30 million or 3 million observations and 2,634 species. So that's an unprecedented number of observations. Tons of observations, but every new observation counts. And as I said before, you might find moths that aren't on there yet. That will be a first for the website. That happens every year. National Moth Week occurs in the last week of, generally around the last week of July. And this is a global project that seeks to kind of understand moth diversity. So you might want to consider looking at National Moth Week and joining that. National Moth Week 2020, in 1 week in Ontario, 1,274 species of moths were reported by over 400, by over 1,700 observers. So that's a ton of effort and producing a lot of really good results. So definitely look up National Moth Week and consider signing up. Now, what we just talked about, so how to find moths, how to track them, and what we can do to kind of help them. It's good to note that birds really rely heavily on moths. So this is a black-capped chickadee in my backyard, and it was feeding its young moth pupae. A good study that's been kind of replicated a few times found that chickadees take 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars to raise one clutch of eggs. So having moths in your environment is very important for birds. But if you're a landowner, how do you increase moth numbers? The answer is to plant native plants and increase native plants. So in Doug Tallamy's book, Bringing Nature Home, he lists sort of the top plants by caterpillar hosts. And I just listed the top 15 right here. This applies to the whole Northeast. But oak was #1 with 534 species, cherry and plum with 456, and then willow, birch, aspen, crabapple, all these plants that we sort of know as keystone, that we know as keystone species, plants that tend to be common in the environment and maybe overlooked sometimes because of how common they are. But these species are great to plant. So if you're looking for a plant, an oak or a cherry, these will support the most number of moths, and your trees might be a little bit holy and eaten, but that's what we want to see. So I'm going to talk a little bit about these moth host plants now and maybe inspire a few gardens. So oak hosts the most number of moth species, and oaks take a long time to grow. So one thing you can do is you can collect acorns and grow trees from an acorn, and they'll grow faster, and you can kind of plant them in hedges. So instead of having oak trees, maybe you'll have oak hedges for a few decades, and those younger trees tend to be very, very attractive to moths. Younger trees tend to be even more attractive to moths than adult trees. Oak beauties also feed on oak. They're one of my favorite species. They're very well camouflaged. So wild cherries and plums. This is a Canada plum that was blooming last year. They're host plants for species like our eastern tent caterpillars. They also host some of our flash species like the owl moth and the cecropia moth. So wild cherries and plums are one of my favorites. I love them because they're a nectar plant. You'll see clearwing moths and all other moths visiting it during the day, and bees, and then it's a host plant for all of these wonderful species as well. So it's a win-win, and a great, if you have one tree to plant a wild cherry or a plum. Willows are also really good. They're a little bit more difficult in a smaller landscape because willows, if they have roots that can get into your pipes. So often, you can't really plant them right next to your house. But if you have a wet area in your yard, consider planting some native willows. They're hosts for rare species like the willow ghost moth, and a whole bunch of other species as well. The flowers are also attractive early in the spring to willow fairy moths, which can be found nectaring on willow flowers during the day. They're one of my favorite moths. They're a tiny micro moth with antennae many times the length of their body, which the males use for sensing the females. Aspens, poplars, and birches are great. So in our area, Luna moths mostly host on paper birch. So if you want Luna moths, plant paper birch. If you want big poplar sphinxes, then plant big tooth aspen, which is a species of poplar. So these I think birches and poplars tend to be overlooked as insect host plants, but they're fantastic. If you go and check the undersides of aspens and birches in July, you'll find tons of caterpillars on them. Maples are also really good. So they're host plants for species like the rosy maple moth, which I think is probably the number two contender for the best moth ambassador after the Luna moth. They look like a stuffed animal. Maple spanworms also feed on sugar maple. Polyphemus moths host on sugar maple, so they're a good plant to plant for those species. Pines, another overlooked insect host plant. Pines are hosts for the pine imperial moth, the northern pine sphinx. Basswoods are also great. They host 150 species in our area. The flowers produce nectar generally starting in the late afternoon into the evening, and so they're great nectar plants for moths, as well as host plants for species like basswood leaf roller, which only feeds on basswood. Dogwoods and viburnums are really good. If you look at that round leaf dogwood, you'll see it has holes in it. So leaves with holes in it are good. When you see plants like that, you know that it's a good moth plant. Both of these species, the viburnums and dogwoods, have nice flat white flowers that are attractive to moths at night. Sumacs are another great one. They host a few really good species like the spotted tana and dark merythesa. New Jersey tea is a wonderful nectar plant. It's great. It's visited by Gervilla clearwing spotted thyrus. It's also a host plant for a lot of really rare species. New Jersey tea is not the most common plant in Ontario. It used to be a lot more common and widespread, but now it's mostly restricted to alvars and oak savanna remnants and tallgrass prairies. So species like the broadline Durastria feed only on New Jersey tea and are very rare because of it. We also have a butterfly that feeds on New Jersey tea, the mottled dusky wing, which is an endangered species that you can only find in areas that have lots of New Jersey tea. So very important, the relationship between moths and their host plant, as their caterpillar host plant. Native honeysuckles are a great one to plant for moth diversity. They're host plants for clearwing moths like the snowberry clearwing, and the flowers are also great nectar source for a lot of moth species as well. Raspberries are another overlooked host plant. These are hosts for crazy species like the hologram moth and the raspberry crown borer. Wild grape produces Pandora sphinxes. Ferns produce pink shaded fern moths and silver spotted fern moths. And native grasses also have native moths that feed on them as well. So native grasses are something that are really important in our landscape. They're a host plant for a lot of species. Now I'm just going to mention a few perennials that are really good. I find milkweed is one in my garden. I get hummingbird clearwing, squash vine borers, milkweed tussock moths that feed on the leaves. So milkweed is really not just for the monarchs. It's a really good one to plant for moth diversity. Wild bergamot and other mints are also visited by moths, especially the hummingbird clearwing. Mints are also host plants for raspberry, pyrausta, and hermit sphinx moths. Evening primrose is a very common plant. If you can find evening primrose growing alongside just most ditches, and you can collect a seed head and just sprinkle the seeds, and you get really great germination off of them. They're a biennial, so you probably won't get flowers the first year, but they're wonderful. The flowers open at night and are attractive to a lot of insect pollinators like the gallium sphinx, and then the seed pods are a host plant for the caterpillars of the primrose moth, which as an adult will sit on those flowers during the day, completely motionless, trying to camouflage. So if you plant primrose, you might get the primrose moth. Aster sunflowers and goldenrods are absolutely great. Hundreds of species of caterpillar feed on them, like the brown-hooded owlet and the wavy-lined emerald. And are probably one of the most important late-season nectar sources for not just moths, also bees and other insects as well. And more moth-friendly flowers species. Think species that have that deep curl where a moth's proboscis can kind of go down into there and get the nectar. So foxglove, beer tongue, spotted touch-me-not, field thistle. Our native thistle is an overlooked species. Is absolutely wonderful for moths. Joe Pyeweed as well is a really good top performer to include in your gardens. And having a messy lawn is good to promote, is something that will promote moth diversity. So just letting clovers and dandelion kind of take over a few areas. It's not the same as putting in effort and planting native plants and restoring native plant communities, but we do have moths that feed on clovers and moths that feed on dandelion, and so you're at least doing something. It's better than a barren landscape essentially. And last but not least, leave the leaves. So a lot of our moths will overwinter in leaf litter or under leaf litter. The polyphemus moth overwinters as a cocoon in leaf litter. The hummingbird clearwing overwinters as a pupa. And so leaving messy areas of your garden with leaves will help support moth diversity and kind of create hiding spaces for insects. These are just a few shots of the garden that I grow. Just a little bit north of the Oak Ridges Moraine, but these species can be found throughout the Oak Ridges Moraine as well. So I planted a lot of bergamot and milkweed, and here's that corner. So I planted them, I wanted to kind of keep things messy, so there's a bit of a chaotic feel. There's milkweed and primrose and bergamot and switchgrass kind of growing all wherever it wants to grow. And this is sort of creating a lot of good moth habitat, a lot of places to hide. And the bergamot is just absolutely full of moths when it's blooming. Also great moth plants, cutleaf coneflower, false sunflower are visited by a lot of species. The bee in the middle is an actual real bee. It's not a really good moth impersonating a bee, but really good. So this is a toadflax brocade also on that wild bergamot. If you can plant one flower for moths, wild bergamot, common milkweed, goldenrod are the top three. And it's also worthwhile to look up kind of group efforts to create pollinator gardens. I'm from Peterborough, so we have the Peterborough Pollinators, which is a local group that's kind of dedicated to spreading the awareness of native plants, and they've planted a lot of really nice pollinator gardens throughout their town. So it's important to kind of get involved with organizations like this and support them, and volunteer yourself. With organizations like that and with land trusts especially. They always need volunteers, and by doing that, the moths will thank you. So I want to stop now for questions. I'll take a few of your questions. Maybe if somebody wants to read a few questions off.
Yeah, I can read those out to you.
Yeah, thank you. So we can do that, and then I just have a very quick sort of fun quiz at the end to end things off.
Okay, sounds good. So we have 6 questions right now. Okay. I don't know if we'll get through any more if they keep coming in, so you can do your quiz. And sorry, everybody, about the closed captioning thing. We were just figuring it out, and near the end of Basil's presentation, we think we figured it out, but it wasn't the best time to actually change anything. But thank you so much for sticking around for that. That was important for us to implement with the closed captioning. Okay, so our first question is from Janet, and this was early on in the presentation. She asked, do the Canadian owlets feed on deer down in the New England states?
Yes, that's a good question. So the Canadian owlets have never been reported feeding on blood or on any animal. So they have the right gear for doing it. They have a proboscis that's sharp and pointed, and members of the same genus in Asia feed on goats and things like that. So it's possible that it feeds on it, but nobody's ever reported it feeding on any animal before.
Okay. And Janet is one of our Common webinar participants, and she always has really great questions. So she has a few more. Do you have bats visiting your moth setups?
That's a great question. Occasionally, yeah. So I don't get it too often, but there's been a couple times I remember I would set up, and in the early evening there was a big brown bat that would come out and it would circle around the moth sheet. And there was one time it caught a polyphemus moth. I didn't really. It was probably picking off smaller moths before they got to the sheet, but it was really dramatic because it was this big polyphemus moth, and it came into the light. And sometimes they don't land on the light. They come to the light and they kind of bounce back. So it came to the light and then flew up a little bit, and the bat just swooped down and caught it. It was really, really cool.
Okay, and another one from her is, are we in a shoulder year of gypsy moths, so fewer than usual this year?
I couldn't say I'm not. I don't really. I'm not an ecologist studying gypsy moths, but that's a great question. I don't really know. I just know that last year, from what people were telling me, it was a 30-year high for them. But what the numbers are this year, I couldn't tell you.
Yeah, maybe we'll figure that out a little bit later on.
It remains to be seen.
Yeah. And with the loss of ash because of the emerald ash borer, are we going to see the specialist moths head to the at-risk category?
Yeah, that's a great question. So as far as moths being at risk in Ontario, we have really only a few species that have that are listed as endangered. One of them is the bog bean buck moth, and it's a moth that only feeds on a plant called bog buckbean, which interestingly enough is a lot more common than the moth. The moth only lives in a few locations where the host plant is, but the host plant's much more widespread. So where am I going with this? The question is, I guess, like that. I guess it sort of remains to be seen. There's not a lot of specialist species that feed on ash, but a lot of the species that do feed on ash also feed on cherry and things like that. So if ash starts to become really rare, I mean, it's plausible. So a species like the Canadian Sphinx might become rare too. They're already a pretty uncommon moth. They're not one of the most common ones, but one thing to keep in mind too with ash trees is that there's often that understory of young ash trees, and young trees tend to be fed on more by caterpillars than older trees. So you never know, it could be creating a situation where there's more young host plants and less adults. I don't really know. I'm just thinking out loud, but yeah. Hopefully that was an okay answer.
I think it's always good to sort of discuss it and do those predictions.
Yeah.
Sure, you know even more than you think you know.
Yeah.
Okay, so this one's a little bit of a situational one. You may or may not have a suggestion. So they're saying we live in a newer subdivision. In the summers, we have a certain moth. It's fairly large, and it lays eggs in a circular pattern on our patio door screen. Is it a particular moth that would lay eggs in this pattern and in such a place?
Well, it's probably a species that's getting attracted to one of your lights, and then often when moths get attracted to lights, the females will just of certain species will just start laying eggs. So it could be a lot of different species. It could be a giant silk moth or a sphinx moth, based on how large it is and the time of year. But I'd have to see a photo of it to know for sure. But this is just sort of a common behavior of a lot of different moth species.
Yeah, and that might be a good opportunity to use iNaturalist too, if you can get
exactly.
it right.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, so next one. Do the male ghost moths that don't mate live much longer?
No, they tend to only live for 1 or 2 nights, so they have a very short lifespan.
Wow. This one's kind of fun. Is it true that butterflies sleep with their wings closed and moths sleep with their wings open?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So yeah, butterflies tend to sleep with their wings flat against their back, kind of flat over their back, and moths tend to look like they have their wings tend to flat out. But it's different for a lot of different species. So for example, Cecropia moths and Polyphemus moths, they'll rest with their wings flat, or they rest with their wings over their body. So it's not really diagnostic of butterflies versus moths, just sort of habits of habits of individual species.
Okay, and we have one more question before we can get to your quiz. And it is, why are they attracted to light?
That's a wonderful question. Nobody really knows the answer to that. There's a whole bunch of different hypotheses, but the strongest one is that basically light when they see, they use the moon and the stars to kind of navigate at night and stay flying in a straight line. And when you turn on a light, it essentially messes with their navigation and they come crashing into the light. And that's the answer, at least part of the answer. There's other people that say that the lights kind of mimic flowers at night, and certain species are attracted to them because they think it's a flower, or that I've heard another theory that moths of different sexes kind of reflect UV in a different way. So moths might think it's a mate, is what some people have told me. But the best answer is basically that it messes with their navigation and they confuse the light with something else and they kind of land on it. But yeah, it's something that's still being understood.
Okay, we actually just got one more in.
Yeah.
So do moths that are active at night sleep during the day?
Yeah, so that's a good question. I don't know if you would call what they do sleep, but they definitely rest during the day. So they tend to rest, a lot of the ones that are very well camouflaged, they'll rest right on the outside bark of trees and you almost never see them. But they rest during the day and then they're active at night.
Okay, and it looks like that is it. And let's see what everybody learned.
All right, perfect. So I have this is a very, very short, like 5-question quiz. And I basically just want you to yell the answer out at your screen at home for me. Oh, before I do that, these are a few references. So if anybody wants to screenshot this, these are a few books, checklists, things like that that are
Yeah, since we have a second, do you mind seeing if we can fix that gray screen just for our own knowledge for the next time?
Yeah.
We think that if you go to the gray bar at the bottom, your Zoom bar where it says like share screen and all that.
Yep.
If you go to more, is there an option that says disable captioning or subtitles?
Yep, I just hit it. Does that work right now?
Oh my gosh, that worked. I wish we knew that sooner. Well, now people can screenshot and get a little bit more of the references.
That's perfect. There you go. So yeah, I'll leave this up for a second. These are a few of these are free PDFs and also other groups to get involved in for identifying moths and learning about how to conserve them, things like that. I mentioned Grow Wild Native Plant Nursery. They're just outside of the Oak Ridges Moraine. They're in Omimi, but that's where I get all my native plants from, and they have a lot of really great native plants. So if you're in the area, definitely check them out.
Yeah, we've actually had
so I'm
Paul
going to start
speak for us as well. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but Paul, who works for Grow Wild, like we've had him do our talks, webinar back in September and stuff. So
yeah, Paul's great.
him is a good place to go.
Yeah, he's wonderful and grows lots of really, really good plants. All right, so here's the quiz. So this is Who's That Moth? So you will see a silhouette of a moth pop up on the screen, and hopefully you'll have been paying attention and you know what species it is. This is a very easy one to start off. This is the Luna moth. Now this is one of the day-flying moths that visit flowers. It's a member of the sphinx moth family. And this is the hummingbird clearwing moth. This one is a little bit of a strange one. It's large and sort of liver-shaped with a comically small head, and it flies in July. This is our four-spotted ghost moth, one of my favorite moths. This is another moth that flies in July. It sort of resembles a predatory cat, and it has an echolocate. It has an ear that can hear bats and then flips back at them to scare them away. That's our great tiger moth. This one here is the largest moth that we have in North America, and you can find it right here in Ontario. That is our Cecropia moth. And last one here, this is sort of the runner-up to Luna moth as far as moth ambassadors go. It's the tiny, the adorable, the maple-feeding rosy maple moth. And they come in white and also in the much bolder pink and yellow coloration. So you can find them in different populations with different colors. All right, that's the end of the quiz and the end of the presentation. So hopefully you learned something and you guys are all inspired to go out and understand moths for yourself. As I've said, it's allowed me to love nature in a completely different way, and hopefully it'll do the same for all of you.
That's awesome. Thank you so much, Baz. I'm sure everyone got A+ on their quiz. And just for everyone who's still on and excited about bats now, I know Basil mentioned National Moth Week. Was it national or international? Sorry, I knew this before.
International. But
International,
it's still
right.
national, yeah.
Didn't want to get it wrong there. So that starts on the 17th of July, which in our All-Star BioBlitz Challenge for Moth Mania starts on the 17th. So if you get involved with that challenge, you're also going to be participating in International Moth Week. So just throwing that out there. I'll send an email with the recording for this webinar, as well as a link to how to get involved with that challenge. So thank you so much, Basil. That was fantastic. And you're getting lots of compliments as well in the chat.
Oh, thank you. Thank you all so much for listening and hosting the event. It's been a pleasure. I love doing these types of things.
All right, fantastic. And I'm sure we'll talk to you soon. And everyone, if you want to volunteer, feel free to sign up or send us an email. Just get to know us. This might be our last webinar of the season. So we want to continue talking with you and talking about opportunities to get involved with us. So, all right, thank you, everybody. Have a great night.
Thanks so much. Good night.